Thank you guys for coming out on this spooky, spooky day and rainy. Well, I have good news, and that is there are monsters in Western Maryland. At least there are, if some local legends and some modern day first person accounts can be believed. And you'll be happy to know that the area is also teeming with ghosts, weird places, and some very colorful characters. And you might know a few of those, like me. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of mysterious Western Maryland. So this map of Maryland was published in 1666 in a book by George Alsop. The book is Character of the Province of Maryland. He came here from Britain as an indentured servant. And as you can see, this is just kind of representing Maryland as far as like the immigrants from Europe were seeing it. It was full of strange creatures. We're not even sure what some of these creatures are, actually. And America was just a very strange place to the early European settlers. It was huge. It was full of dense forests. There were already perfectly awesome people here who had lived here for thousands and thousands of years, but the settlers considered and called these indigenous peoples savages. And there was also abundant wildlife, the likes of which Europeans had not necessarily seen. So to the early settlers of Maryland and America in general, anything could be out there, as far as they know. Our first stop is in the Middletown Valley. On February 12, 1909, a newspaper called the Middletown Valley Register warned that an enormous flying monster was in the area. The really bad news was, according to the paper, that this monster had already killed one man, a fellow it snatched up as the unfortunate guy walked along a road. It had carried him off to a hilltop, punctured his jugular vein with its long needle-like beak, sucked out all his blood, and then tossed his body off the hillside like yesterday's chicken bones. According to the newspapers and various eyewitness accounts, this is what the monster, who came to be called the Snallygaster, looked like. It had enormous wings, a long pointed bill, 4 legs with claws like steel hooks, 1 eye in the center of its forehead, a screech like a locomotive whistle, a pointed tail 20 feet long, and a really interesting thing happened after this crazy seeming story broke. People started reporting that they had seen, and in some cases, been chased by this flying monster. Over the following weeks, the Register and other local newspapers were full of local folks' encounters with the Snallygaster, and with rather fanciful stories. One newspaper wrote, "The latest report is that the government intends to send a troop of United States soldiers and a Gatling gun to the area, with the hope they can kill the dreadful monster. The Smithsonian Institute, however, wishes to capture it alive. It is said that President Roosevelt is so anxious to see the monster he may postpone his African trip, a safari, until it can be captured." This was followed by the late-breaking notice that the monster was last seen at Lover's Leap south of town. Mr. John T. Baker of Frederick was nearly frightened to death by a huge monster which was flying about 50 feet from the ground, and it appeared to him to be about the size of a large horse. Eventually, the Snallygaster got into a big altercation with some fellows who were hanging out at the train station down in Emmitsburg, and supposedly it even picked up one of the guys by his suspenders and started to fly off with him. But fortunately, the man's suspenders broke, and the gentleman, who was a real person named in the paper, survived. The Snallygaster disappeared and was last seen at that point heading toward Carroll County. But that wasn't the last of the Snallygaster. The paper had reported that the monster had laid some eggs in a barn in Sharpsburg, and perhaps that's why in 1932, reports of Snallygaster sightings started coming in again. After more of the usual Snallygaster type hijinks, the creature met his demise in a very unique and timely way. It was trying to get a drink at a local moonshine still and fell in. Some prohibition agents who happened to be on the scene, which is where this photo comes from, showed up and blew the vat of moonshine up, Snallygaster and all. Again, these agents were named in the paper. They were real prohibition agents and were even quoted in the paper. One of them, an agent named George T. Danforth, was quoted as saying, "Imagine our feeling when our eyes feasted on the monster submerged in the liquor vat." So where did the story of the Snallygaster really come from? There's a pretty good chance that the Jersey Devil is at least partly to blame for spawning the Snallygaster. It's probably no coincidence that the first report of the Snallygaster came right after the Jersey Devil stories had been making headlines. So it's a pretty safe bet that the popularity and interest that the Jersey Devil generated maybe sparked the Middletown Valley Register Snallygaster. And as for the unique name of Middletown's monster, this is another similarly named monster. This was from a book that was about the same time, this was 1910 that the book was published, at the same time the Snallygaster was terrorizing Western Maryland. This creature, the Snallygaster, lived in a swamp down south. And you might notice that there's a certain segment of the population that this particular monster was interested in. And that's where I tell you there's really, really bad news about our Snallygaster. The origins of the Snallygaster are from not-so-subtle stories published in the Valley Register. And they let us know that racism, more specifically, discouraging black men from voting, were the dark forces that were actually behind the birth of the Snallygaster. The fanciful, fun Snallygaster served as a veiled threat to black men, as in, y'all better think twice about voting. So this is obviously a very blasphemous and discouraging use of a monster. I mean, like, they literally said it. I mean, people will argue about it, but they literally said it. So, yeah. So there have been scarier things than monsters in Western Maryland. The Snallygaster has very problematic origins, but the stories it spawned, such as the return of the monster at the end of Prohibition, don't necessarily have the same element of menace as the original Snallygaster that was invented by the editors of the Middletown Valley Register. But ultimately, most people who had heard of the Snallygaster back in the day, after the time, that it was in the newspapers, like mothers would say, little Betty and Bobby get into supper before the Snallygaster gets you, don't stay out after dark, that kind of stuff. Pretty innocuous compared to the actual origin of the Snallygaster. So that kind of sucks as far as an origin for what could have been a cool monster. But the Snallygaster may not have been a real monster, but there's another breed of monster that's still a little more of a mystery. And that leads us to our next stop, the South Mountain area, just outside of Boonesboro, where you'll discover that the Snarly Owl has his very own spot on a wayside marker for the National Road. The Frederick County, Washington County areas have a long history with being infested with strange dog-like creatures. And the oldest story that we know of is that of the Snarly Owl. And there's something pretty unique about this particular monster. And that is being on a wayside marker, which I think is the coolest wayside marker anywhere. The main reason the Snarly Owl story survived is because in the 1800s, a Washington Society woman, a writer named Madeline Vinton Dahlgren, the widow of Civil War hero Admiral Dahlgren, bought what was then called South Mountain House, and turned it into her summer retreat. She soon became very interested in all the weird stories the locals on South Mountain told, and she compiled them and published them in a book called South Mountain Magic in 1882. One of the tales was that of the Snarly Owl, also referred to as the Black Dog, the Dog Fiend, and the Werewolf. The folks on South Mountain at the time were largely poor, hard-scrapple, a very superstitious lot who believed in magic spells, witches, ghosts, and monsters. And the cool thing was that many of the stories in Dogman's books weren't necessarily all old folk tales that had been passed down. The mountain folk told her lots of first-hand stories about things that these people in the area said that they themselves had experienced. Dogman spoke with one neighbor, whom she called a good sturdy type of mountain man, who claimed to have encountered the Snarly Owl. She told his story of getting into an altercation with the beast. One night, about 10 o'clock, as he was returning from the village of Boonesboro, he encountered the black dog. It was black and bigger than any dog he had ever seen. And as he came nearer, the object stood guarding the road in such a way as to forbid his crossing. So, to use his own expression, he fit it. That is, he fought it. But to his confusion, as the creature was attacked, it grew longer and presently seemed to extend all the way across the road, making no noise but showing a very wide, very ugly-looking red mouth. And all the time, as his thick and heavy blows rained down upon it, the sinewy arm of the woodsman met with no resistance, but rather seemed to be beating the air. Another man said that he had encountered the Snarly Owl, shot at it, but the bullets had gone right through it. And yet another man encountered the Snarly Owl while on horseback, and his horse was so alarmed that it threw the man off the horse, and his collarbone was broken. So this was quite a dangerous creature in some ways. In that same area, there were also stories of other phantom dogs. One, a ghost dog that would join you if you drank from a certain stream, and another phantom dog that dragged a big chain around. Oh, and there was also talk of a fabulous headless phantom dog. And P.S., as many probably know, the black dog or phantom dog stories are found in folklore worldwide and are especially prevalent in Great Britain. So Great Britain may have been representing too among all the Pennsylvania Dutch lore that was found from the German settlers on South Mountain. So next, we're going to stop by the mountains around Gambrel and Cunningham Falls Parks. This guy here is a creature known as the Dwayyo. Nobody seems to know exactly where the name came from, but this picture and the headline, Mysterious Dwayyo, Lucerne County, appeared in the Frederick News Post in November of 1965. According to the Post, a fellow named John Becker had not only seen an upright walking 6-foot-tall dog-like creature, but the creature had attacked him on his property, which was just on the outskirts of Gambrel State Park. After the story broke, there followed, of course, a rush of Dwayyo sightings. At one point, a Dwayyo hunt was planned, and apparently 100 people signed up for it. But as far as anyone knows, the would-be posse never followed through on actually searching for the monster. Whether the Dwayyo was a figment of someone's imagination, a made-up monster, or something real remains unknown to this day. The Dwayyo, seen in Frederick County in the 60s, sounds an awful lot like something that is known today in the cryptozoological world as a dogman. Dogmen are one of the creepiest monsters out there because, unlike some beings like Bigfoot who try to avoid people and are usually non-confrontational, dogmen tend to be pretty aggressive and seem to have really bad attitudes. Luckily, this is a dogman from like Michigan, Wisconsin area, so I think we're safe out here. But there are a few Frederick County dogman encounters besides the Dwayyo. One was reported on the blog Phantoms and Monsters, and it goes, in the summer of 1966, the creature was sighted again on the outskirts of, this is one that may have been related to the original dog, Dwayyo. The creature was sighted on the outskirts of Gambrel State Park again. A man only referred to as Jim A. encountered the creature as he was heading toward a campsite. It was described as a shaggy, two-legged creature the size of a deer that had a triangle-shaped head with pointed ears and chin. It was dark brown in color, and when approached, it made a horrid scream and backed away from the man. Jim described it as having an odd walk as it retreated. Its legs stuck out from the side of the trunk of the body, making its movements appear almost spider-like as it backed away. It's pretty creepy. This report originated with Linda Godfrey, the late author and actual investigative reporter who came to specialize in dogmen after covering a series of strange sightings for a local Michigan newspaper. But our dogmen made the pages of this book, The Michigan Dogmen, Werewolves, and Other Unknown Canines Across the USA. She wrote, in the fall of 1976, near Thurmont, between Cunningham Falls State Park and Catoctin National Park, two men drove off Route 77 and onto a private road so they could spot deer by their headlights in order to see how thick the local deer population had become. To their surprise, they did not catch a deer in their headlights, but instead a large animal, ran across the front of their car. They described the creature as at least 6 foot tall, but inclined forward like a wolf since it was moving quickly. Its head was fairly large and similar to the profile of a wolf. Its body was covered in brown fur. The forelegs were held out in front as it moved. The back legs were very muscled and thick. This was not a hominid-type creature. It did not have the characteristics of an ape. It was much more similar to a wolf. However, it was definitely moving upright. They were particularly impressed by the size and strength of the back legs and the large canine-like head. This story of a dogman encounter is especially interesting because it's a fairly recent report, and it was told firsthand to a Reverend Robin Swope, a minister in Erie, PA. This is Reverend Swope's very dramatic account that was given to him by a young woman he refers to as Aubrey. According to Aubrey, she was driving one night on the edge of Gambrel State Park on a road lined with trees in the late summer of 2009 when she had an eerie feeling. It was as if she was being watched. According to her, as she turned onto the road where her friend lived, the feeling became overwhelming. She slowed down, and that was when she saw the creature. At first, it was just a blur to the right of her peripheral vision, something moving through the trees. Whatever it was, it bobbed through the underbrush and between the trees to keep pace with her car. She thinks at the time she was only going about 25 miles per hour. Suddenly, the brown, blurry smear of color seemed to bound out of the woods, and with a massive leap, the hazy color became flesh as a huge dog-like animal on 2 legs emerged from the darkness. The fangs, Aubrey said, are burned into her memory, huge fangs in a mouth that seemed to grimace in anger and hate. Drool dripped from its huge mouth as she heard the loud growl, and she looked into its dark eyes. Then it leaped, arms outstretched with claws grasping the wind. Instinctively, Aubrey stepped on her gas pedal with all her might. So, yeah, that's pretty creepy. So, and just FYI, if you're concerned about dogmen, as I am, someone has actually created a map of North American dogman sightings, which you can find online if you care to look it up, just if you're worried. Good, and now we're going to stop by Mount St. Mary's University, where there are some very cool ghost stories. This is a picture of Mount St. Mary's in 1863, but it was founded in 1808, so it's obviously got a whole lot of history and supposedly a whole lot of hauntings as well. These gentlemen are known as the founding fathers of the Mount, and all of them are still supposedly there in spirit form. I worked with a lady whose son, Jake, lived in the dorm room at the college that is the most notoriously haunted of the dorm rooms. It's known as the Haunted Dorm, Brute 252, and he researched the spirits of Mount St. Mary's and told me some of these stories. This is a modern day photo of Mount St. Mary's, looking lovely. And this is just supposedly, I would assume, hopefully harmless priest, but he just looks spooky in context, so I'm gonna leave him up there. There's a spirit known as the drunken nun, and she's been seen wandering the halls of the terrace storm. This poor soul had been a heavy drinker. One night she slipped on some icy steps and took a fatal fall, and she's still seen around the college. There's a room called the Bleeding Room. It's 2 rooms on an upper floor, and these rooms have come down with an alleged case of structural stigmata. The rooms and walls produce a sickening, sticky red substance. Builders have tried to cover the walls, but the substance continues to seep through new layers of drywall. There is a ghost known as the Hand, and it's important to know that the mount was founded prior to the abolition of slavery, and there are several graves on the hillside behind it that will attest to the fact that enslaved persons were held by the good Christians of Mount St. Mary's. It's said that there was an enslaved man whose hand was cut off as punishment for allegedly stealing, and the man soon died of an infection following this grievous punishment and was buried in the cemetery. These days, people claim to see a dismembered hand scurrying around the terrace quad and even up the sides of the buildings. I asked Jake if he had any first-hand encounters with ghosts at Mount St. Mary's, and he said he had. He said, "I personally saw Reverend Brute wandering the halls at least twice. This was very close to my room. My first encounter, he nodded politely and moved on. This was maybe the 3rd week of school, but we were all pretty spooked by that point. When I realized seconds later who he was, I spun around and he was gone. It spooked me pretty bad, and I had to be coaxed out of the room later on for dinner. The second time I saw him, it was several months later, and we were fairly used to his antics by then. I openly acknowledged him, but he ignored me and kept walking on." These are just some of the eerie entities of Mount St. Mary's, and there's an Instagram account called Mount Ghost Stories that I recommend you check out for more spooky fun there. And this familiar looking building is where we are right now, and you'll be happy to know that it is allegedly quite haunted. Yes. So in 2013, when I was working on this particular book, I visited this museum and interviewed Lori Eggleston, who was curator here at the time, and also George Wunderlich, who was the director. So I'm a little out of date because they are no longer here, and other fabulous people are. So this is Dr. Richard Burr in this famous Matthew Brady embalming photo. Back in the 1800s, this building was a furniture making undertaking establishment, and Dr. Burr for a time worked here. And I'm going to read just a little piece from my book, which explains why this particular gentleman may have contributed to some of the angry spirits that may be haunting this building. So the ghosts in this downtown Frederick Museum are often playful, but sometimes they're downright scary, and it's no wonder. The building was used not only for undertaking for many years, but also at one point by a doctor who became notorious for both a macabre Civil War photo he posed for and some very unsavory practices he is alleged to have engaged in. Embalming and unsavory practices don't exactly make a recipe for good karma, if you've ever seen a horror movie. Back in the 1800s, furniture making and undertaking went hand in hand. A fellow named James Whitehill ran the undertaking and furniture making endeavor in the building that now houses the museum. from the 1830s until after the Civil War. With the war between the states came many sadly necessary breakthroughs in the field of undertaking, most notably the rise of embalming. Sometime after the war, a Mr. Clarence Carty took over Whitehill's business. But it just may be another man, one who moonlighted there during the fall of 1862, who is responsible for the unhappy spirits who now inhabit the museum. Dr. Richard Burr is known for several things. He is often credited with pioneering the arterial embalming process. Arterial embalming, by the way, is the process of commandeering the body's vascular system to drain out blood while pumping the body full of those helpful chemicals known as embalming fluid. Burr is also the guy shown embalming an unnamed soldier stretched out on a weathered door in the famous and chilling Matthew Brady photo. Yes, somebody had to do it, but nobody had to do the other things Dr. Burr has been accused of doing, namely robbing the bodies of the dead and dying on the battlefields and, in his spare time, selling and reselling the same headstone over and over again. Like a ravenous buzzard, Burr hovered over the battlefields of the Civil War, waiting for the opportunity to ply his trade and perhaps pick up a little something extra by rummaging through the pockets and knapsacks of the casualties of war. Burr was a general physician before the war, but after enlisting, he found his niche in as an embalming surgeon. In September 1862, fate smiled a ghoulish smile on Burr in the form of the battles of South Mountain and Antietam. The enterprising embalmer soon encamped in the conveniently located undertaking establishment of Mr. Whitehill, ready to swoop in as scores of bodies piled up. So perhaps it is the long-ago presence of the nefarious Dr. Burr that put the spirits of 48 East Patrick in such a bad mood. Whatever it was, there have long been tales of ghosts associated with the building, and many of the descriptions have the spirits looking angry and not so happy looking. Perhaps the most striking spirit seen in the National Museum of Civil War Medicine is the one often called John Hart, who is said to have been a one-time employee of the undertaking business. As if it wouldn't be alarming enough to encounter a ghost, this spirit is described as grim-faced, imposingly tall, and sporting high black boots. At least one person has reported being punched by this intimidating ghost. This foul-tempered fellow has also been alternatively identified as both Carty and Whitehill, but then again, perhaps he is the disgruntled spirit of one of those unfortunate men the greedy Dr. Burr embalmed and possibly robbed in the bloody days of 1862. Another frequently seen specter in this building is known as the Woman in Gray. Dressed as if she's from the 1800s, sporting a sour expression, the Woman in Gray has been spotted again and again over the years. I walked into her coming out of the bathroom, a female employee reported recently. She was not happy looking. On another occasion, a sighting of the Woman in Gray is said to have sent a tutor who was working with a staff member's daughter in the third floor research library running out the front door. Not all of the ghosts are quite so menacing. As a matter of fact, some of them are what passes as playful in the spirit world. Paper clips inexplicably shooting out of their holders in staff offices, books flying off the shelves in the bookstore, the laughter of children, an invisible somebody ringing the doorbell. These things have happened so many times the museum staff members hardly bat their eyes. They say that the spirited ghosts seem to be especially fond of the ramps that separate the floors of the museum, and visitors shouldn't be surprised to hear the pitter-patter of phantom footsteps following them. A ghostly figure wearing a large straw hat was once seen strolling up a ramp by a worker watching a security monitor. And the spirits might not all be human. The museum's director occasionally hears a phantom kitty clawing on the carpet in his office. So I don't know if you can verify any of those stories here, but
I had an experience, but not any of those folks.
Oh, really?
But and this is a good moment, I think, to pitch our haunted history tours that we are now giving. And if you guys want to sign up for those, we give you a tour of the museum after hours in the dark, and we will take you up to the third floor, which is normally not accessible to visitors, because that's the most haunted floor of the museum.
Sounds like.
So if you guys are interested in taking one of our haunted history tours.
And they only do it nocturnally?
Wow.
Yes.
Nice.
So if you're interested, you can sign up at the front desk downstairs for our haunted history tours.
Are they every weekend for the?
It's every weekend till Halloween, the weekend right before Halloween. So we've got an extra spooky tour that is on the 28th for adults only.
I thought that was the 29th.
Or is it 29th?
29th is a Sunday at 5.
Yes.
Yes, I'm there, thank you.
All right, excellent.
Cool. So what was your experience, if you don't mind
My
sharing?
experience?
Yes.
Actually, I was, my office is on the 3rd floor, and I was there actually a little early in the morning, and I was looking down the hallway, and I saw a gentleman with a beard walk across the end of the hall, and I thought it was one of my coworkers. Actually, he's working the front desk today. You'll see he has a full beard. And I thought it was him, but it was his day off. So I thought, well, what's he doing here on his day off? And I went down to see what was going on, and there was nobody there.
Sweet. Well, can only be a ghost.
That's it.
I believe. Well, returning to our tour, we are going to stop by South Mountain, just outside of Boonesboro, and make a quick stop at Zittlestown, to be specific, and meet the Zittles. One of the coolest things about South Mountain in the 1800s was that there was a fellow who was actually considered to be a wizard living there, a wizard complete with his very own magic spell book. He was known as Wizard Zittle from the area of South Mountain along the national road called Zittlestown. The Zittles were a colorful clan, and in this photo we can see an assortment of Zittles, unfortunately not identified, but we can see there are quite a few of them. You can see here a pair of scissors hanging, which was something like protective as far as folk magic. So the Zittles were a great source of stories for Madeline Vinton Dahlgren's South Mountain Magic, but she was less than gracious in her descriptions of the Zittles. For instance, in describing Zittlestown, she wrote, "Here vegetate some scores of souls, Zittles, married to Zittles, related to Zittles, or connected with Zittles. Some of these cabins almost buried in the forest depths, as well as others perched on cliffs beyond. Ignorance, tainted by belief in magic, has taken the unearthly form of superstition." She was very dramatic. The man known as Wizard Zittle was actually Michael Zittle Jr. of recent German descent. He famously carried a little spell book full of enchantments that he used to cure sick babies, sick cows. People apparently came from far and wide to be healed by him. One of the most interesting things about Wizard Zittle was that just a few decades ago, his mysterious spell book actually turned up in a local home, and it is now on display in the Boonesboro Museum of History. And there are still lots of Zittle descendants in the area. And our next stop is the gallows of Western Maryland. In old school Western Maryland, there was no such thing as a bad day for an execution. Spectators were famously not deterred by bad weather. Estimates of attendance at execution of William Cotterill and Sons in Cumberland in the 1800s. One historian wrote, "The day appointed for the execution was wet and cheerless, yet thousands were gathered in the streets of the town and along the roads leading into it. Various estimates have been made of the number present at the execution, ranging from 10,000 to 40,000. That's not what this is from, but this is from somewhere in, I believe, Washington County. This photo originally came from Doug Bust at the Boonesboro Museum. In Western Maryland, executions were good for more than pure entertainment. When it came to the actual body of the executed person, there was somewhat of a feeding frenzy. It seemed like practically everyone had a good use for a dead body. Parts of the body and the hangman's noose were considered good luck charms. Hard to figure that one, but medical students and doctors were often in the market for a dead body. In fact, one highly esteemed Hagerstown physician once absconded with a body he snatched right after an execution and he propped it up behind him on his horse to make it look like a live rider, and galloped all the way back to Hagerstown with the body falling over like a sack of potatoes. And every once in a while, he would have to slow down and turn around on the horse and prop the body back up into a sitting position. The most bizarre account I came across of the unsavory things that folks would do with a dead body happened after the hanging of a convicted murderer in Cumberland. A local historian reported, when life became extinct, the body was taken down and conveyed to the old courthouse, where the physicians made some experiments with it. It was afterwards dissected, and old Joe Schumott, an eccentric man, secured a portion of the skin and tanned it, the leather proving very soft and pliable. So indeed, executions really did offer something for everyone, and one dead body could go a long way in Western Maryland. We're going to stop by Carroll County to take in a few of the weird sights there. One of the most notable, and this made news all over the country and continues to be considered a story of some note in certain circles, is that of the Sykesville Monster. Beginning in March of 1973, people began reporting sightings of a creature described on several occasions as looking like an ape and having glowing red eyes, sometimes glowing yellow eyes, in and around Sykesville. The Sykesville Monster seemed to be especially fond of strolling by the railroad tracks, but he was also spotted in several backyards near a utility station and just kind of hanging out along Route 32. Here's an example of a few of the reports of encounters with the so-called Sykesville Monster. From the News American, June 8, 1973, a family on Oklahoma Road reported seeing a large ape in their backyard. From the Carroll County Times, Howdy Gasaway reported seeing the creature on the railroad tracks behind Schoolhouse Road at 4:30 in the afternoon. From the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, June 8, 1973, a truck driver reported seeing a dark brown creature caked with mud sitting on the side of Route 32. The creature stood, appeared to be between 7 and 8 feet tall, and ran into the woods. And the Sykesville Monster was actually investigated by the police, by the people from the Baltimore Zoo, and also by this gentleman who is an old friend of mine and all-around colorful character named John Lutz. And you may have seen John on shows like Monster Quest, if you're somebody who watches things like Monster Quest. John headed a group called Odyssey Scientific Research at the time of the Sykesville Monster sightings. The organization was based out of Baltimore, and if you read articles about the Sykesville Monster from 1973, many of them include interviews with John, who was on the scene investigating throughout the sightings. At the time, John worked for the Maryland State Police as a dispatcher, and he says that when the police and other authorities would get reports of strange things, they would call him up and say, "There's a creature roaming around," and ask him and his group to investigate. John says he was called in on the case of the Sykesville Monster after the creature picked up a state trooper and threw him 15 feet. John says this with great earnestness. Says John, after the town police officer event, Sykesville Police Chief Omar Hebert contacted Maryland State Police, and Lieutenant Colonel Woodrow Corbin suggested a manhunt. That brought zoologist Dr. Ted Roth, Odyssey researchers, and multiple police officers to the area to determine what animal was terrorizing southern Carroll County. And apparently, Dr. Roth, the zoologist, brought along a big wire mesh net, just in case. These sightings, however, just sort of eventually died out, and a lot of mystery surrounds the case of the Sykesville Monster to this day. It's often cited in Bigfoot books and websites as a Sasquatch, but there have been a lot of speculation that the so-called creature was actually just somebody with really bad personal hygiene, possibly someone who had taken a little unapproved leave from a nearby facility. But the Sykesville Monster did indeed have many of the classic characteristics of Sasquatch, including its size, glowing eyes, and strength. And I wanted to throw in a little bit of one of my favorite things, which is out-of-place animals, especially mountain lions, because everybody in this area that I talk to seems to know someone who's seen a mountain lion or has a story from their family. And according to quite a few reports, there are some really, really big cats in western Maryland. Oops, I guess that's my only mountain lion too. And John Lutz, who investigated the Sykesville monster, his specialty over the last 30 years until his retirement was what are commonly called big cats, i.e. cougars, mountain lions, panthers, but more specifically, he documents and investigates reports of sightings of big cats in areas where they aren't supposed to be, including this one from Carroll County that he told me. This was some years back in the late 70s. John was investigating, along with a state trooper, reports of a mountain lion along Route 32. A woman had reported that she was hanging up laundry in her yard when she heard her little son say, "Mommy, can I play with the cat?" And she turned to look at him, and to her horror saw that he was petting a mountain lion, which was stretched out, sunning itself in her yard. The cougar ran off without harming anyone, but the family dog had recently been attacked by something unknown and had gotten 70 stitches. The clincher of the story is that while they're investigating, John says he actually saw this mountain lion and a cub. Mountain lion sightings never really go away. There are plenty of them in Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania. I've had plenty of people tell me about firsthand sightings. A gentleman I knew in this area told me that he had a friend back in the 60s or 70s who had a mountain lion in a pen on his property, and that this man said he would occasionally accompany his friend as he went out driving along the back roads to shoot at groundhogs from a pickup truck, as the mountain lion enjoyed snacking on groundhogs. So, it could possibly be that there are mountain lions related to illegal, zoos or pet keeping, who knows, but there are a lot of sightings of them. So, and that is the end of our tour of Weird and Wonderful Western Maryland. Look for these exciting books by Susan Barrett, if you would. Thank you all so much for coming. I'd love to take any questions or hear anything spooky anyone has to share. And thank you guys for coming, and thank you for sharing that story.